We're not talking about actors. We mean a real monster.
I brought her back. She'll live and I'll get her another body.
I know they're gonna kiss me, but don't let anyone see me like that. Please, Doctor, help me!
Biologically speaking, it's of primary importance that man should want to mate. Hey, that's...
You don't get all your kicks from surfing, do you?
We want to be free to ride our machines without being hassled by the man. And we want to get loaded.
You think you're gonna make a slave of the world? I'll see you in hell first!
The American International Podcast.
Are you ready?
I welcome you to the American International Podcast. I'm Cheryl Lightfoot.
And I'm Jeff Markin.
And today we're talking about Kidnapped from 1971.
Kidnapped was directed by Delbert Mann, from a screenplay by Jack Pulman, and based on Kidnapped and Catriona, aka David Balfour, by Robert Louis Stevenson, and produced by Frederick Brogger for Omnibus Productions.
Kidnapped stars Michael Caine as Alan Breck, Lawrence Douglas as David Balfour, Vivien Heilbron as Catriona Stewart, Trevor Howard as Lord Advocate Grant, Jack Hawkins as Captain Hoseason, Donald Pleasence as Ebenezer Balfour, Gordon Jackson as Charles Stewart, Freddie Jones as Cluny MacPherson,
and Jack Watson as James Stewart, Peter Geoffrey as Mr. Riach, Roger Booth as Prince William, the Duke of Cumberland, Geoffrey Whitehead as Lieutenant Duncansby, Andrew McCulloch as Andrew, Charles Stewart's clerk, Claire Nielsen as Barbara Grant, John Hughes as Simon Campbell, and Terry Richards as Mungo Campbell.
We open on a quiet Scottish morning. Then our narrator, David Balfour, gives us a history lesson on the Scottish Rebellion, Bonnie Prince Charlie, and the Battle of Culloden. As the credits begin, we see red-coated English looting the bodies of the dead Highlanders, and there are a lot of them. Any survivors are summarily executed where they lay. Some family members, though, are allowed to reclaim the bodies of their fallen loved ones. The hated English soldiers survey the damage with a smile.
Surveying the damage he's caused is Prince William, the Duke of Cumberland, and the son of King George II. He asked to have a message relayed to his father, the king, and to tell him that the pretender to the English throne has been thrashed on this day. And during his recitation, we see more of the war happening, houses burning down, and even more bodies.
What the Duke of Cumberland calls this is the pacification of the Highlands. And of course, this means going house to house, killing all the men. The Duke says that the rebels may expect no quarter as they gave none. The Jacobites will never dare to rise again. But not all the men are killed. 3,000 men were sent to English jails awaiting execution or transportation.
And he ends by claiming that no more will the clans rise in Scotland. As some of the prisoners are being escorted to Edinburgh, David Balfour watches the line of prisoners pass by.
And then he takes over as the principal character. We follow him on a dark and windy night to a stone house standing on the moors. David knocks on the door. The answer comes from a crazy-haired man pointing a gun out an upstairs window. The man demands to know what David wants. He introduces himself and says that he has a letter for Ebenezer Balfour.
The man tells David to leave it on the step and be gone with him, but David insists that he has to deliver the letter to Ebenezer Balfour directly. The man asks for David's name, and when David tells him, the man stops and says, "So your father, Alexander, is dead then?" Then he tells David that he'll be right down to let him in.
Inside we find that this is Ebenezer Balfour. Ebenezer offers David his own porridge dinner. Before he introduces himself, though, Ebenezer asks for the letter. When David hesitates, he snaps that he is Ebenezer. In the letter, he learns that his brother Alexander died 3 years prior, and his wife 3 years before that. Ebenezer seems more upset by this, saying that the death of David's mother is the real shame here. She was a bonny lassie. A bonny lassie.
David takes the opportunity to describe to his uncle how he had been taken in by a Campbell after his father's death. I think we need a quick history lesson about the clans in Scotland.
Sure, go ahead. You know a lot more than I do at this point.
I don't know about that, but what my research did turn up was that two of the biggest clans were Clan Stewart and Clan Campbell. Like
a rhinestone cowboy they were.
And Clan Campbell. And it seems there was no love lost between the two of them. Based on what happens during the course of this film, it appears that the Campbell clan was among the first to give in to the English, while the Stewart clan was willing to fight for their independence a little bit longer.
Ebenezer starts quizzing David on what he knew before he came there. David admits to Ebenezer that he knew nothing of the House of Shaws or his uncle before he arrived. Ebenezer asks if his Campbell friend, the minister who took him in when he was orphaned, knows anything about Shaw's either. David says no, which to Ebenezer means that David is all alone in the world, and he seems pretty happy to hear that.
Ebenezer tells David they have matters to discuss, but it can wait until tomorrow. He gives David directions to a room where he can sleep tonight and a key to the door. As David opens the door into the hallway to go to his room, he turns and asks for a candle because the passage is dark. "Night candles," said Ebenezer. "Just stick to the wall and you'll be fine." So David heads down the passage, hugging the wall, and it's a good thing too because doing this helps him avoid a pit in the middle of the floor.
Then he has to climb a stone stairway. There's rats on the stairs, and David has to pick his way carefully up them. He almost falls at one point, but finally he reaches the door at the top. He opens it, steps out, and would have fallen to his death had he not kept hold of the handle. Pro tip, before you go in a doorway, look to see what's on the other side.
Downstairs, Ebenezer is praying, so he's very surprised when David grabs him by the throat mid-invocation.
David demands to know why his uncle tried to kill him. He starts to drag him off, but Ebenezer plays the "I've got a bad heart" card, and he asks for his medicine, which is out of his reach. David hands it to him. He takes a sip, but David won't allow him to have any more. He wants answers. But once again, Ebenezer puts him off until morning.
Before going to his room, Ebenezer asks David not to let the fire burn all night. It's a waste of fuel. The next morning, David is chopping wood to replace the fuel he's used.
Well, good for him. Making sure that self-care is important. Back inside, David's eating his porridge when he hears Ebenezer talking to someone. He goes to the closed door and tries to eavesdrop, but doesn't hear much before the men barge into the room. The guest is introduced as Captain Hoseason. He and Ebenezer have a West Indies trade venture together. Captain Hoseason likes the looks of David. He tells David he's a lucky young man. Ebenezer wants David to receive the profits of the trade venture to set him up for life.
David turns wide-eyed toward his uncle, and Captain Hoseason bops him on the back of the head.
What a schmo. When David awakes, he's aboard a ship down in the hold. The captain comes down to talk to him, and David attacks him, but the captain says we're at sea. There's nowhere to go but in it. And David demands to know where he's being taken.
Captain Hoseason tells David that they're headed for the Carolinas, and David is to be sold into slavery.
Well, he's to be an indentured servant, but it's basically the same thing. David asks why he's being made a slave, and the captain says for the money, of course.
Then one of the crewmen, Mr. Riach, comes in. He sees David and asks if he's all right now. The captain says he's fine, and he can serve as the new cabin boy.
The captain asks Mr. Riach to show him his duties. And then I guess some time passes because we see some shots of the ship sailing and the crew at work. Then, as David is serving dinner in the cabin to Mr. Riach and the captain, the boat collides with something.
The ship has run into a small boat. As that boat sinks, the boat's sole passenger is brought aboard the ship.
This man, played by Caine, who hasn't introduced himself yet, confronts the captain. He says that they're the wrong lot and they've run down and sunk his boat. I guess he was expecting the French.
The captain says something about sympathizing with rebels for the right price, so the man says that the captain's sympathy and his money should get together and discuss business. So the captain invites this new man to the roundhouse for a discussion. And he tells David to bring the gentleman some food.
Inside the roundhouse, the man, who we will later find out is Alan Breck, offers the captain 60 guineas to leave him in Cluny. Then Mr. Riach demands to see the coin first, and Breck obliges by dumping them on the table. Their eyes widen a bit too far. They say they want half of the money belt or they'll hand him to the soldiers.
Breck says he can't agree to that, and he puts his hand into his shirt in a way that suggests he has a weapon. So the captain agrees on the original 60 guineas. Then they leave him in the roundhouse as David delivers the man's food.
David and Breck chat for a bit. Turns out that Breck has lived in France for the past 5 years, trying to raise arms and funds for the Jacobite cause, and he expects to go back there. He tells David his bottle is dry, and David offers to go get the key, which will enable him to bring back more of whatever he's drinking.
Below deck, the ship's crew and Captain Hoseason are discussing their new visitor. They could overtake him easily if he were anywhere but the roundhouse. But that's where the weaponry is kept. Just then David comes down, and this gives the men an idea. He can go where they cannot. So they devise a plan to have David go in, grab a few pistols and powder, so that they can overcome this man and take his gold.
They even offer him a few guineas as a reward, but David just glares at Hoseason as he's handed the key. He can't be stupid enough to trust them at this point, I think. He returns to the roundhouse and he spills everything. Breck asks if David will join him, and of course David agrees. He's not a crewman, he's a prisoner. Then they unlock the pistols and charge them. I guess that means load them? He tells David to only shoot in his direction if they have him down. He fights better without holes in his head.
They continue to make small talk as Breck assesses the current situation. He pulls on a sword and brags about his ability with it. And then he asks for David's name, and he finally introduces himself, Alan Breck. He says he has a king's name attached as well, Alan Breck Stewart, but he prefers to keep things simple.
The captain enters, and Breck pulls his sword. Captain says, "Naked steel. What a way to repay our hospitality." The captain retreats, though, warning David that he'll remember this. Above them, we can see men crawling over the skylight.
The pistols are now loaded, so Breck has David watch the skylight while he himself keeps an eye on the door. David does take his eyes away from the skylight for a moment, and a crewman falls through the skylight. Others charge into the room, but Breck and David easily dispose of the lot of them.
Well, mostly Breck is fighting with his sword and dagger, but David does manage to shoot a couple men, and he knocks another one out. When the battle ends, Breck says, "Am I not a bonny fighter?"
And he warns David to be ready because they will try to come at them again.
They need to recharge the pistols. Then they hear a strange noise, kind of a whapping noise. After a second, David says that means there's no one at the wheel, and the tiller's swinging free. Breck says those men are as poor sailors as they are fighters. Breck does a little more Campbell bashing, and David tries to defend his father's friend, but Breck says only a Highlander would understand the true evil of the Campbells.
But Breck is interrupted as the voice of Captain Hoseason calls out that there will be no more fighting. He says there's not enough crew left to run the ship. Breck puts his sword down on the table and asks David to hand him a pistol. Then he motions for David to cover the door.
Alan goes up through the skylight, where he sees the captain. He tells Breck to put down his guns, and he repeats that there's not enough men left to sail the ship. But just then, David warns Alan to look out. 2 men attack, and he shoots, but it really doesn't matter. The boat hits some rocks, and the whole thing breaks to splinters as the water rushes in.
Where are they at this point? Are they still headed to Loch Cluny? Because it seems they've been in sea for a while, and there shouldn't be too many rocks jutting out of the water between Britain and the Carolinas.
Well, if they're going to Loch Cluny, that's in Scotland. They don't have locks anywhere else, and that means they probably were hugging the shoreline.
But have they decided to go to Loch Cluny?
Well, they made a deal for the 60 guineas.
It doesn't mean they were going to do it.
I don't know, but they're near rocks anyway.
At any rate, the ship goes down.
Breck and David attempt to crawl through the wreckage, disembarking just as the last of it goes under. And then the next day, we see the two have washed up onto a shore.
Breck is crawling onto the shore, and he sees David and goes to revive him. David says that he thought he saw Breck go under, but Breck said that he and water don't mix. He is destined to be hanged, not drowned. Then Breck grows most serious. This, he says, is Campbell country. To get to France from here means he'll have to get a boat, and to get a boat, he'll have to go to Edinburgh. And between here and Edinburgh are an infinite number of British soldiers looking to catch him.
He suggests that they split up. David should travel alone for his own safety, but David's headed to Edinburgh too, to get justice from his uncle. He wants to know why he had David kidnapped and sold into slavery. Breck tells him that he's had bad luck with his relatives, so he should be more choosy with his friends.
But because of his story, Breck is going to relent and allow David to travel with him. He says they can go to his kinsmen, the Stewarts. There they will receive money and food for their journey. Breck explains that he lost his money belt in the water. Then he tells David the rules. When he says run, run, and when he says hide, hide.
Then he and David slosh off. We cut to the next scene where Breck and David are crouching behind some heather as some redcoats ride past. Then we see the expanse of beautiful Scottish scenery as they trudge on. Breck takes a moment to enjoy it, though. He says when he's in France, he longs for the lochs and the heather.
As they continue on, they see a clan, and Breck thinks they may be able to get a bite to eat with them. But as they watch, the Campbells come in and attack the clan. Breck recognizes the instigator as Mungo Campbell.
Mungo and the soldiers wipe out an entire family, man, woman, and children. David gets sick just watching this, but Breck seems resolved to do something about it. They press on, and by evening they are finally at the Stewart home. A beautiful redhead rushes into Alan's arms. Her father, James Stewart, says, "I thought you were in France," but Alan tells a little bit of how he got there and says if it weren't for David Balfour of Shaw's, he never would have made it alive.
The redhead, whose name is Catriona, is surprised to hear this. "A lowlander?" she says. "Aye, but as good a man as I have ever met, and he's been a good friend to me." And based on this, James Stewart welcomes David to his home.
As they're introduced, it's pretty clear that David's enchanted by Catriona. Breck hears some commotion and looks over to ask what's happening. James Stewart says that they are burying their weapons. Breck says they need to wrap them up first before they bury them so they can use them again. But James Stewart argues that there's no need. They're never going to fight again. Breck contends that the pretender Bonnie Prince Charlie will return, but Stewart doesn't care. Prince Stewart, he says, was no more Scottish than the English king, and they don't want him there. Then this argument carries on until they go to dinner. Breck has the floor and says that he still wants to fight for the Scottish rule, but James is tired of fighting. The Bonnie Prince never cared for the Scottish men who fought and died for him. They didn't have food before the battle, and the prince sure did. And James won't ask that of them again.
This conversation doesn't hold much interest for David, who is nodding off, so James tells Catriona to take him out to the barn and make him a bed. As she does, James and Breck continue their conversation.
James offers Alan some money, and Alan asks for a dirk and a pistol too, and then the two make up a bit. James Stewart says that Breck shall have all three.
In the barn, David asks Catriona if she's known Alan long. He's her born cousin, she says, though she's only seen him 3 times. First time when she was 12. Those were the good old days. They had enough food in those days, but Alan Breck will bring those days back. And though her father, James, has given in to the way things are, he's seen too much of the starving and the suffering to want to fight anymore, she says that he would happily go back to those old days if he could.
Catriona goes to leave, and David asks if he'll see her in the morning, but Catriona says Alan will want to leave at dawn, so no. She asks if he wanted to see her for any particular reason, but he doesn't really know what to say to that. So she bids him good night and safe journeys, and as she walks outside the barn, we see her smile to herself.
The next morning, David is awakened by the sound of shouting.
When he wakes, he sees Alan staring out of a window of the barn. David joins him and sees what Alan sees, redcoats. Alan tells David to go warn James, and he does.
Breck is sizing up the situation, and he recognizes the leader as Mungo Campbell. Mungo calls out, "James Stewart, by order of the British King." James supposes that they may only want food, so he's going to go out to talk to them, but a shot rings out. James and David look out to see Mungo Campbell fall from his horse. A second shot rings out, and James is hit in the head.
Catriona comes out to help her dad, but David forces her to run. She doesn't want to, but he drags her away. The English are shooting up the rest of the household, and at the retreating forms of David and Catriona as they run away. Alan pops out of the tree where he was hiding, and he tells them to run this way. And off they go.
When they finally have a chance to stop and rest, Catriona cries out that her father has been killed. David asks why anyone would have been so foolish as to have taken that first shot. Breck says that first shot killed Mungo Campbell, and there's nothing wrong with that. But he backpedals a little when David stares at him and says that he was tempted. Don't get him wrong, but he wasn't the one who shot him.
Then he pulls Catriona to her feet and says they have to get going. The redcoats can't be far behind. And indeed, they're not. They have to crouch and hide, but eventually they come across a house where the redcoats have already murdered everyone, so they're safe for a minute.
There are dead bodies laying about, and they find another tied to a tree. Breck sees a couple of English soldiers with their horses, laughing, and Breck sneaks up on them. He takes them by surprise, and drawing his sword, he disposes of each of them. When Breck returns to David and Catriona, he finds that David has busied himself digging graves.
And then they walk on. They get to a stream where Catriona nearly collapses. Breck washes his face, and while he's looking into the water, he sees a reflection from the other side of the stream. It's a tartan-clad, red-headed man with a big smile. Breck looks up and calls Cluny. So this is a happy reunion.
This is Cluny MacPherson, and he has made himself a home in a cave, and he has invited Breck, David, and Catriona to join him there. Cluny is happy to hear of Mungo Campbell's demise, and is sorry to hear of Catriona's father's death.
Cluny offers to house Catriona there while she waits for word for her father. He might not actually be dead, but she doesn't know either way. Then Breck wants to know how Cluny can be okay living in a cave and not coming back to France with him. Cluny says that Breck may be a warrior bold and brave and knows no other life, but that's not him. And then he asks David if he would like to play a hand of cards.
David says that he was brought up to believe that gambling brought no good to anyone, winner or loser. Cluny is offended by this and asks Breck what kind of man he has brought into the house of MacPherson. Breck reminds him that David is a friend of his. Then Cluny invites David to step outside. David explains that it was a promise he had made to his father, and that he's very tired. So Cluny tells him that there are beds in the back if that's what he wants. As David and Catriona stand to leave, Breck tells Cluny to deal the cards.
David gives him a dirty look, and Cluny blusters that David's morality is his own, and others need not adopt it. Then the two start their game as David and Catriona bunk down in the cave next to each other. Catriona's skirt is in tatters, so it's lucky that Cluny has offered to replace it. Cluny and Breck play cards and continue to argue. Cluny will help him if he returns for another fight, but he has no intention of waiting around in Paris and dying an old man there.
The next morning, Breck and Catriona are outside the cave, saying goodbye. Catriona will be staying with Cluny until they get word of her father. Back in the cave, Cluny is trying to give David the winnings he took from Breck in the prior evening's card game. David is reluctant to take it, but Cluny says he couldn't take money from people in their position. So David accepts it, saying that he still doesn't understand, but thanks him for his hospitality. And Cluny yells after them that he just likes to play the cards.
David goes outside so he can also say goodbye to Catriona, with the hope that they will meet again. After they depart, David stupidly gives Breck his money back, and a fight ensues. Breck feels shamed that David took back, even though it was only offered to him, the money that he lost fair and square. David thinks Breck was stupid to gamble it away in the first place, and that Breck should have asked for it back himself, so they don't starve all the way to Edinburgh. Then Breck insults David's family. David replies back with an attack on the Stewart's hygiene, saying that he never met one that didn't need a bath. Alan slaps him. David draws his blade, and Alan does too.
Then Alan lowers his blade, saying that he can't do it. Then he starts to laugh at David's insult and adds that David isn't too clean himself. Just then, Catriona runs up. She says her father's alive and he's been taken to Edinburgh to stand trial for the murder of Mungo Campbell. David says that James didn't do it, and Catriona says she has to come with them to Edinburgh so she can see her father.
Our next stop is Edinburgh Castle, which is currently lousy with redcoats. Alan, David, and Catriona hide in the shadows for a bit when some are passing by. Once the coast is clear, they enter the office of Charles Stewart, attorney at law. Stewart is very unhappy to see them. He mentions that Breck has a £200 bounty on his head for the murder of Mungo Campbell. David says that I thought they had arrested James Campbell for that, and Charles says that they're both implicated.
David says that that's the reason that he's here, to give a statement to the Lord Advocate that James Stewart did not murder Mungo Campbell.
He then asks who Catriona is, and she says she's James Stewart's daughter, further flustering the attorney. Charles says that all he wants are his books, his bottle, and a Saturday golf tournament, not Highland claymores and plants. He's had 30 relatives in there before, meaning there are 30 times he could have been hanged. His advice to David is to leave. They have James and they'll hang him, and anyone with evidence to the contrary. But David is willing to take the risk. Charles says it's no risk, it's a foregone conclusion.
They're interrupted by a knock at the door. At the door is Charles's clerk, Andrew. Charles brings him in and explains that he has relatives here who need a boat to France and a place to stay in the meantime. Andrew knows a place where Breck can hide, and there's room for David and Catriona near him, and he can get Alan on a boat provided they have the money. It'll be £50, but there's only 20 in the kitty. Where can they get £30? David knows where it might be had.
And then we cut to Shaw's, where Alan pounds on the door, demanding entrance. Ebenezer answers the door in the usual way. From the window, gun drawn. Breck says that he's here about David. He found him washed up on a beach, and he wants money for taking care of him all this time. Ebenezer will have to pay, and Ebenezer refuses. Then Alan switches tactics. Okay, he and his friends will take some money to have him killed. That's what he wants, right? Ebenezer is not down with that either. He says, look, I paid 20 guineas for Hoseason to kidnap him and take him to the Carolinas, but I don't want him dead.
Just then, David comes out from hiding, along with Catriona and Andrew, and David thanks his uncle for saying that, and that his friends will testify to that effect. Breck laughs.
And Ebenezer just gapes like a fish. And now we're inside, where we see Alan counting all of Ebenezer's coins. He only has £28 and a few shillings. Alan asks if that's all, and Ebenezer nods. You've tossed my place upside down. Breck tells Ebenezer that his place is in jail. And then Ebenezer starts weeping. He starts telling David that he thought he'd be dead before David came seeking his inheritance, which is Shaw's. And David just looks at him. Yes, why did his father give it to Ebenezer?
Ebenezer explains that David's father took Ebenezer's girl, so somehow Ebenezer took his inheritance.
And that girl was David's mother, of course. Breck tells Ebenezer that he can stay in Shaw's for now, but he needs to go see Charles Stewart, the attorney, and make it right with David. Ebenezer takes his leave from the room, saying that David's dad may have died without money, but he was still a richer man than Ebenezer would ever be. And then Andy tells everyone that it's time to go.
Breck says goodbye to Catriona, then to David, advising him not to visit the Lord Advocate tomorrow. James is going to be hanged, and Breck would hate to see David swinging along beside him. Then he leaves with Andrew to go to his new hiding place.
So, of course, the next time we see David, he's coming in for his appointment with the Lord Advocate Grant. After a mere 4-hour wait, David is shown in. He tells the Lord Advocate that he's there to prevent a miscarriage of justice. And Grant says that this is the place to do that. But his expression sours when David mentions James Stewart. Grant tells David that there's no miscarriage of justice there. But David says that there's been no trial. Has everyone made up their minds already? The Lord Advocate agrees to take his testimony, but warns David to only answer the questions as he asks them. David says he will, but he's also not going to conceal information if the right questions are not asked.
David is asked if he was present at the house of James Stewart and if he was there by accident. David says, in a way, he was walking to Edinburgh and needed help. He notes that the Lord Advocate has not written anything down. Grant says that David has yet to say anything noteworthy, and if he were the one who were on trial, his words would be more strictly notated.
Then Lord Advocate Grant asks if David was alone on his walk. David says no, he was with Alan Breck. And Grant is startled to hear that confession. Does David really want to admit that? David says he must admit it or else he'd perjure himself. Then David comes in with James Stewart's alibi. David was standing next to him, and Stewart was unarmed when Mungo was shot. The Lord Advocate says that he is responsible for many innocent lives, not just that of James Stewart. He says the Highlanders can only be ruled through the Campbells, and a murder was done on Stewart ground. He asks if the Campbells are not entitled to justice, and David says, justice, yes, but not vengeance. Lord Grant says that this is the Highlands, where the difference between the two are very small.
Grant explains that this is a political trial, and thus this is the only way to keep the Campbells from taking their own vengeance. So David must drop the matter for the sake of Scotland's peace. David insists that a man's innocence is at stake, and if the country has to fall for it, then so be it.
He also says that if the Lord Advocate won't take his evidence, then the other side will certainly want to. The Lord Advocate says that he could have David arrested, and David says he's slept in worse places than jail. Grant says that David should return in the morning, but in the meantime, tell no one else what he knows. And then there's a knock at the door.
Lord Advocate Grant's daughter, Barbara, comes in to tell her father that she's going shopping. So Grant has her take David with her so he can pick out a new suit, and he wants Barbara to show him how to set up a line of credit.
If David is a landowner, he should look the part. He begs David to let him do this for him. And as he leaves, once again the Lord cautions David to remember what he said.
Lord Advocate Grant is only alone for a moment when Simon Campbell comes in. He heard the conversation and wonders why David was let go. Grant explains that this might give them an opportunity to capture Breck. Then they can have a 2-for-1 hanging.
But the Advocate thinks that he can make David come around.
Breck is looking out at the water when he notices David riding out towards him. David dismounts his horse and hands Breck the money he needs for the boat and tells him that Charles Stewart wishes him well. Breck says that it's France for him and for David a life of ease. Then Breck raises his hand. He hears something and runs up the hill to see a bunch of soldiers on horseback.
Of course, David was followed. Alan and David mount the one horse and ride off, and eventually they lose the tail. Once alone, Breck goes off on David for going to see Lord Advocate Grant when he specifically was told not to. He yells at David to forget James Stewart. David protests, but Breck doesn't listen. He tells David to go to Charles and arrange another boat, and don't return to Alan. He'll find them.
Then we see Charles Stewart paying a visit to the room David is boarding. He tells David that he's decided to take James Stewart's case. David will be invited to testify should he wish to.
Charles then gives David a letter that will allow Catriona to visit her father, and David can go with her to the prison. Charles says that he'll arrange the boat, and Andy will give them the details.
Charles says that for a lowlander with Campbells for friends, David makes a hell of a rebel.
The next day, Catriona has an emotional jailhouse reunion with her father. James thanks David for his friendship, very unexpected. Then he has a heart-to-heart with Catriona. He's going to die, and she needs to make her peace with that. Catriona tells him that David is going to testify for his defense, and James orders him not to. David's confused because everyone keeps telling him not to obey the law. That's not how he was raised, so he really doesn't know what he's going to decide to do. He will promise nothing, except to think about it.
But he doesn't have time to think about it now because visiting time is up and Catriona and David are escorted out of the room. As they're leaving, a soldier bumps into David. At this indignity, the soldier introduces himself as Lieutenant Hector Duncansby, and he challenges David to a duel.
This duel does not go well. David has a sword, but by the third time that he's dropped it, Hector declares that he's too much of a gentleman to kill a wimp like David, even at the request of the Lord Advocate. Catriona and David realize that David was almost murdered. Now we're back at the inn, where David finds Alan in his room. David gives Alan the new boat schedule, and Catriona arrives with some breakfast for all. It's all very nice until there's a knock at the door.
Breck jumps into a wardrobe while David answers the door to find Lord Advocate Grant and his daughter, Barbara. Barbara implores David to let them in as the Lord Advocate has come to apologize, and that is something that doesn't happen often.
David lets them in, and now the room is very crowded. David introduces the Grants to Catriona, and Catriona to the Grants. The Lord Advocate is there to explain that Simon is the one who arranged the assassination attempt, not him. David is not placated by this news. Then Lord Grant lectures David about the Scots being 500 years behind the English and how they need English rule to get them out of their tribal mentality. And while all Highlanders are savages, the Campbells are savages on the side of right. The Stewarts are savages on the side of wrong. David doesn't care about all this fancy talk that he barely understands, but if it means James Stewart must hang tomorrow, then Grant is wrong. Grant hints that if only Alan Breck were there, then maybe James could be saved. He curses Alan, saying the future of Scotland belongs more to James Stewart dead than Alan Breck and his future fruitless rebellions that will only cause more battlefield deaths. Then he remembers that Catriona's there listening to say that her dad's got to die, and he lamely apologizes.
Grant and his daughter leave. Barbara's stopping to tell David, "See, I told you there'd be an apology." Now that the coast is clear, Breck comes out from hiding, and David asks if he was the one who killed Mungo Campbell. Breck denies it, and Catriona curses the Lord Advocate because she was busy with him instead of attending the porridge, which has burned.
Now we're in a totally different location. It's Ebenezer Balfour's deathbed. There's a doctor there listening to his breathing, and he looks at David and Catriona and shakes his head. Ebenezer asks to speak to David, who comes up close. But Ebenezer's last words are, "Dinna let him charge you too much." And then he dies.
So now the House of Shaws belongs to David. Catriona begs David not to testify. Even her father doesn't want him to testify, and she doesn't want to lose both of them.
She looks at him lovingly, and then she kisses him. She says they can just stay there and be left alone. But pig-headed David won't give up the good fight.
So next we see Catriona calling on Breck's secret hideaway. She tells Breck that David's gone to testify, and she wants Breck to stop him. Breck says he thought that she wanted David to testify, but she says that she can't bear to lose them both. So if Breck isn't able to stop David from testifying, she wants Breck to break James out of prison instead. She even has a plan. But Breck won't hear it. He refuses to risk breaking into and out of Edinburgh Castle, even for James.
He says that if James lives, he'll do nothing for Scotland, and that's what she should be thinking about. She repeats that her father didn't kill Mungo Campbell, but Alan doesn't care. She's never left Scotland, never known what it's like to long for the pipes on the wind and the freedom of the Highlands. James would have just given it all away to the English, but not Alan. He's going to France to hang with the men of the other clans, Cameron, Macintosh, etc., to wait for the day when they can come back and fight for Scotland. That's the only cause he will die for. But who wants you to, she counters. There's no more fight left in Scotland. And then she runs away. Alan vows that it's not over. Everyone's just waiting for him to come back.
He looks out and remembers the days of battle, fighting for their continued independence from England, and the time he shot and killed Mungo Campbell. It was him. With tears in his eyes, he knows what he must do. David and Catriona are waiting to meet the boat, but Breck hasn't arrived yet.
The man on the boat says that he can't wait, but they ask him to. Breck has to be there soon. But Breck is somewhere else entirely.
We see Breck marching into Edinburgh Castle. The guards ask who goes there, and Alan replies, Alan Breck Stewart, here to see the High Governor, and he marches through Edinburgh with the guards following him.
As he passes some imprisoned Highlanders, they give him a round of chain clinks as he passes. I guess they're happy to see him.
And the movie suddenly ends with Mary Hopkins singing For All of My Days over shots of the Scottish countryside.
Welcome back to the American International Podcast, where we're talking about the movie Kidnapped from 1971.
Frederick Brogger, who co-owned Omnibus Productions with his partner, American actor James Franciscus, made 4 classical adaptations of novels, all of which were directed by Delbert Mann. Heidi in 1968, David Copperfield in 1970, Jane Eyre in 1971, and Kidnapped.
The movie's working title was David and Catriona. Delbert Mann said they wanted to focus more on those characters than on Alan Breck, but that he also wanted to give Breck more guts and more balls than he was traditionally portrayed as having. Scenes were written having Breck commit premeditated murder, but censors forced the filmmakers to cut them out.
Franciscus told the Detroit Free Press in 1971, "We saw that no one was doing the classics. We felt there was a need and a place for that kind of film. The films were sold to NBC Television, who had the right to show the films twice in the USA. They were also made for theatrical release. The films were expensive because they were shot on location."
During the filmmaking process, though, the producers realized that the film would be too expensive for television. Once NBC heard this, they pulled out. The project was then refinanced with American International Pictures putting up NBC's share instead. This made Kidnapped Omnibus's first purely theatrical film. AIP at the time was attempting to make a series of movies based on classic novels, after the success of their adaptation of Wuthering Heights.
Leads Loris Douglas and Vivien Heilbron were relatively unknown. Filming started in London at Pinewood Studios on May 10, 1971. Location shooting began in Scotland on May 30th in Argyll, Mull, Culross, and Stirling Castle. The opening moorland scene of the end of the Battle of Culloden was filmed in Argyll, with Highlander extras provided by Lochaber High School and Redcoat extras by Oban High School. Pinewood Studios was used for some interior scenes.
Caine later said that he never got paid for the film. Quote, "They made it when they didn't have the money to make it. I got a small percentage just so they would be able to release it, to get some money back on it. It was an absolute and utter disaster from beginning to end," end quote. And Mann confirmed that, quote, "No one was paid fully." But he says that Caine, quote, "was a key figure to get us through it," end quote.
Mann says a number of actors had to be looped because American audiences would not understand the thick Scottish accents. Jack Hawkins had to have his voice dubbed in for every movie he appeared in after 1966, when he lost his voice permanently. An operation for throat cancer left him with a tracheotomy, and he wore scarves in every scene he's in to conceal the site of the surgery.
Kidnapped was released in the United States on December 22, 1971, and in the United Kingdom on May 4, 1972. Box Office Magazine advised theater owners to lean into the classic literature angle, having special group screenings for students and offering bookstore tie-ins with the book and the classic comics editions of the story.
Taglines for Kidnapped include Robert Louis Stevenson's great adventure story, now a monumental motion picture.
The story of a girl's love, boy's courage, and a rogue's reckless daring.
An all-new entertainment experience.
The all-new entertainment experience was called by the Los Angeles Times something of a disappointment. Pauline Kael said, "Jack Pulman has drawn a trim, craftsman-like screenplay, and the director, quote, keeps everything comprehensible, though he doesn't know how to make the narrative stirring. Fortunately, Michael Caine acts Alan Breck with a mixture of swagger and intelligence that keeps the movie alive."
The New York Times Review savaged the production, saying, "Far from trying to hype up the material of Stevenson's novels, the movie version of Kidnapped mostly depresses it. There is almost as much plot, but there are many fewer people and much less action, to the degree that you sometimes don't know what is happening because of the sheer immobility of what ought to be the moving pictures on the screen. Everything bespeaks low budget in the sense that many of the shots making up individual sequences don't fit together, and that some of the costumes don't fit at all. Except for the locations, which are real, and the color, which is color, the whole thing suggests the dim listlessness of the Late Late Show, edging toward the catatonia of 3 a.m.
Box Office Magazine had mild praise for the production, saying, "The fourth screen version of Robert Louis Stevenson's classic novel comes across as an excellent attraction for adolescents and adventure seekers, but considering the talent involved, something more ambitious was undoubtedly intended." But the review had kind words for Caine, who, quote, "contributes a colorful characterization as the rebel who believes Scotland's destiny is in his hands."
AIP was able to scare up a number of good pull quotes for its press book, including one from the Dallas Morning News, calling Kidnapped the best picture I've seen in 1971, and another from the Hollywood Reporter calling the film outstanding, easily one of the best films of the year, a magnificent production.
Kidnapped disappeared off the top 50 movies chart at the end of January 1972 after grossing less than $160,000. It undoubtedly made more than that, but we couldn't find anything definitive on the box office take.
In April 1972, Sam Arkoff called the film a good, opulent movie, but business has only been medium. He felt the lack of something different has held back the film.
Some notable cast appearances from the Kidnapped players include Michael Caine as Alan Breck, who would go on to appear in The Destructors in 1974 and Dressed to Kill, the last AIP-produced film, but which came out from Filmways in 1980.
Trevor Howard, who played Lord Advocate Grant, had previously appeared in Lola in 1970 and would later appear in Hennessy in 1975 and Meteor in 1979.
Jack Hawkins, who was Captain Hoseason, also appeared in Lola in 1970. And Donald Pleasence, who played Ebenezer Balfour, would go on to appear in Raw Meat in 1972, The Devil Within Her in 1976, and Jaguar Lives in 1979.
Freddie Jones, who played Cluny MacPherson, would appear in Old Dracula in 1974, and Jack Watson, who played James Stewart, had appeared in Conga way back in 1961.
Peter Geoffrey, who played Mr. Riach, appeared in both The Abominable Dr. Phibes in 1971 and Dr. Phibes Rises Again in 1972, both times as Detective Inspector Trout.
Andrew McCulloch as Andrew, Charles Stewart's clerk, had appeared in Prior the Banshee in 1970 and would appear in The Land That Time Forgot in 1974. And Terry Richards, who played Mungo Campbell, appeared in 1,000 Convicts and a Woman, also in 1971. And though not AIP, Terry Richards also appeared in a memorable role in Raiders of the Lost Ark as the Arab swordsman that Indiana Jones shoots down rather than take the time to duel. So getting unexpectedly shot and killed seems to be his shtick.
Well, everybody needs one. All right, Jeff, we've exhausted our research on Kidnapped, so let's tell the listeners what we think of it. Using our scale where A is awesome and I is intermediate and P is pathetic, what did you think of Kidnapped and why?
Well, going into it, I figured Kidnapped would be an okay movie, and my expectations weren't very high. But I feel Kidnapped more than delivered. Kidnapped came at a strange time in American International's history, when they were trying to class up their image, so we have films like Wuthering Heights and Julius Caesar, films that would never typically be associated with a company like AIP. But here it is, and it's just kind of a weird blip in AIP's history. I wasn't familiar with the source material at all. After a quickly aborted attempt to read the novel when I was around 10, I never gave it much thought after that. It didn't have the same draw for me as Robert Louis Stevenson's other novels like Treasure Island and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, both of which I did read at about that same time. Had I realized it was historical fiction, I might have been more accepting towards it, because I've always been intrigued by that genre. But the historical characters presented here are people I would have had no knowledge of, so perhaps not. They weren't taught in American history classes, for obvious reasons. But as an adult, and having access to the internet for quick research, I was able to get much more from watching the film Kidnapped than I possibly could have by reading the novel 40-some years ago. The performances here are all spectacular. If anyone might stand out as less so, it would have to be Lawrence Douglas as David Balfour. He has a constant look of confused bewilderment on his face, and it does seem to fit any situation David finds himself in. So it's not really distracting, but as the main character, he's kind of meh. But then it's probably difficult to look anything but bewildered when sharing the screen with the scenery-chewing Michael Caine as the confident, cautious yet cocky Alan Breck. There is so much to like about this film beyond the story, though. It has a magnificent score, composed and conducted by Roy Budd, and there is an uncredited appearance by what might be the most important character in Kidnapped, the Scottish countryside as itself. In several scenes, Caine's Alan Breck professes his love for her, and as a viewer, I get it. It's lush, it's green, it's beautiful, and it's simple and natural, the kind of place that is easily put out of mind in this day and age with the distractions that modern life gives us. I've been to Edinburgh, and I remember it being a lot like it is pictured here, though that was 40 years ago, and they may have changed a bit in the time since. I wish I had seen Kidnapped prior to my visit. I probably would have had a better appreciation when visiting the castle. So my review is undoubtedly skewed by my own personal feelings and experiences, and while as an AIP film, it might receive a lower grade in a stricter category against other AIP films when judging an AIP film, but as a film in general, I found Kidnapped to be wonderful on all aspects, and I'm going to give it an A. What do you think, Cheryl?
Like, yeah, I was prepared to be a little bored by a film that brought a 138-year-old book to life, but honestly, that wasn't the case. Maybe it's because I have a bit of interest in this period of Scottish history, thanks to the decidedly sexier Outlander book and television series, but I found this to be a very enjoyable adventure. Mostly, that is down to the swashbuckling antics of the brave but misguided anti-hero Alan Breck, played with verve by Michael Caine. And I was surprised because I've honestly never thought of him as attractive before seeing this film, but he's really dashing here, though he's got a frustratingly repetitive habit of pestering everyone to keep up the doomed fight against the English, and that got old pretty fast. It's not that he's wrong, it's that there's no one left to fight. The English brutalized the remaining Highlanders to teach them a lesson, and they all appear to have learned it, all except Alan. Breck is an anti-hero who also borders on villainy. His unprovoked killing of Mungo Campbell caused nearly every bad thing that happened afterwards, but he seems very unrepentant about it, even lying to Catriona about being responsible for her father's imprisonment. But that complexity means that he's far and away the more interesting character, compared to the other male lead, Lawrence Douglas as David Balfour. I think we agree on this, that though he ultimately proves to be the more heroic man, David is a very dull boy. He's extremely easy to fool. He glares rather than takes action, and he spouts off moral judgments of others. Oh, and he's a terrible duelist. Catriona is more interesting than David when she's given something to do besides wringing her hands over her father's fate, but that isn't very often. This story veers a bit afield from either the Kidnapped novel or its sequel, which both were used in the making of the movie. But in comparing the story of the books to the story of the movie, I find that Jack Pulman's screenplay actually seems like a more cohesive and exciting story. For example, Catriona doesn't appear in Kidnapped. She appears in the sequel, David Balfour, which is also called Catriona, and there's a lot less of Alan Breck in the books. And yet, I feel like this movie could have used more sword fights and less trial prep scenes, especially as no trial was even held. They spent a lot of time on that, and it ultimately went nowhere. And that left us with an ending that was so abrupt, leaving a lot of important questions unanswered. What happened to James Stewart? What happened to Alan Breck, for that matter? Since the movie and the books don't coincide, we'll never know. And like you, I give this movie a lot of extra points for its lovely locations. Have the Scottish Highlands ever looked more beautiful? This entire movie makes me want to visit Scotland as soon as possible, because unlike you, I've never been there. I want to soak in the natural beauty of the land and just bask in the glow of the sun on the Highlands. And like you, I wonder if it still looks the same, but it's got to be beautiful still. I just know it. I decided to give Kidnapped an I, but if we gave half grades, I'd bump it up to an A-. I was a little bored at some of the trial stuff, like I said, and David Balfour could have been played by a more engaging actor, I think. But those are kind of minor knocks, so I think I would give it an A-, honestly, if we gave those grades. I would recommend this movie to anyone who likes sweeping adventures based on literary novels, the kind you should have read as a kid, but probably didn't. So I think you should watch this movie. Well, all right. I think we've answered as many questions as we could with this podcast. So until the next time, I'm Cheryl Lightfoot.
And I'm Jeff Markin.
And we'll meet you at the drive-in.
Follow the American International Podcast on Instagram and Letterboxd at AIP_pod and on Facebook at facebook.com/American International Podcast.
The American International Podcast is produced and edited by Jeff Markin.
A man whose mind is distorted by hatred.
And Cheryl Lightfoot.
A girl hungry for too many things.
The American International Podcast is part of the Pop Culture Entertainment Network.